Welcome back to Psychology 650. The purpose of this video is to review the Diathesis stress model of anxiety and panic. During this video, we're going to take a short look at the physiological structure of the brain, focusing primarily on the limbic system and thalamus, the amygdala, and talk about the physiology of crisis. I'll conclude by giving you a case example and a short critique of the Diathesis stress model itself. As you can see from the above slide, a great deal is known about the brain. For example, in the back part of the brain, we have the occipital lobe that's responsible for vision. Below that, the cerebellum, which is how we coordinate movement. This structure of the brain stem is also known as the medulla oblongata. It's responsible for subconscious processes like heartbeat and respirations. Parietal lobe is responsible for movement. The frontal part of the brain is used for executive and logical functioning. Now we're going to take a look at the deeper insides of the brain, which is the oldest part of the brain itself, exploring the amygdala and the limbic system as well as the thalamus. So the brain is a bilateral organ. In other words, the left and the right sides mirror each other pretty well. So for example, you'll see that the structure here called the amygdala is on the left and on the right. The hippocampus is on the left and on the right. So we have actually, it shows one, but there's actually two amygdala and two hippocampus, just to give you a frame of reference. The limbic system and thalamus have been part of the human physiology for millions of years and are critical to our survival as a species. Every sense except smell is delivered to the thalamus first, so the amygdala can rapidly scan them for anything it perceives as a threat. Our sense of smell is processed by a highly specialized organ of the brain called the olfactory bulb. This scanning also involves the hippocampus, the portion of the brain responsible for retrieving memories from long-term storage, which is also quickly scanned by the amygdala. The amygdala then constantly scans the environment for sights, sounds, smells, and textures it determines to be a threat. This is primarily a subconscious process, much like our breathing and heartbeat. So let's take a look at the physiology of crisis. Everything, and that's sights, sounds, smells, and textures about a significant emotional event are processed by the hippocampus and put into long-term storage for future use. For the rest of our lives, the amygdala will be on guard for any sight, sound, smell, or texture that the event that was initially recorded is about to happen again. And I'll explain this by using a case example in just a minute or so. So remember, this is all a very subconscious process. Once a sight, sound, smell, or texture activates a memory of a past significant emotional event, the amygdala triggers other parts of the brain to release hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. The issue is, once the amygdala is triggered, it can release the same hormones at the very same levels that were released during the original event. So it can literally feel like that event is happening all over again. It generally causes a reaction of fight, flight, or freeze. And we see this in the animal world. Badgers, for example, well, badger will fight anything. It's not afraid of man. It's not even afraid of a man carrying a gun. It will attack. Prairie dogs, when they sense a threat, they scatter quickly into a hole. And rabbits, well, they have a tendency to freeze. Fight, flight, or freeze. Ordinarily, we process our thoughts through the frontal parts of our brain. These portions of the brain evaluate our thoughts, determine our options, we weigh our pros and cons, and we decide what we're going to do in response to a particular situation. This is very much an intellectual process. If I experience, for example, an impulse, this part of my brain is going to filter it and help me decide if I'm going to act on the impulse or not. The frontal lobe, as you know, can be altered by substances, especially alcohol. So when we take a look at the right and the left side of the frontal portions of our brain, we can see that alcohol, for example, can cause these portions of the brain to malfunction. So on the right side of my brain, I have impulse control, and it's where I weigh my pros and cons. On the left side is where we have what is generally called social interest, or my ability to empathize with other people. Under the influence of alcohol, you've noticed that people say things and do things they ordinarily wouldn't say or do. They're socially disinhibited. If someone abuses alcohol, for example, over a long enough period of time, their ability to control impulses and to act socially responsibly is even impaired when they're not under the influence. So the frontal lobe is very important to our ability to process cognitive, intellectual processes like deciding what we're going to do. But in a crisis, the amygdala bypasses the frontal lobe altogether, and I'll explain why. When activated, the amygdala bypasses the front portions of our brain and sends signals directly to the portions of our brains, such as the regulation of heart rate, breathing, blood pressure, or other subconscious processes, as well as to the areas of the brain that are responsible for movement. The amygdala is responsible for keeping it safe. It really doesn't have the time and really isn't interested in having a crisis first go to our frontal lobe, where we're going to stop, evaluate it, weigh pros and cons. It doesn't have time for that. It needs a course of action, and it needs it now. So think of the amygdala as being an automatic pilot in a response to a crisis. So in a crisis, we need to immediately respond in order to remain safe. It's the amygdala's job to keep us safe. So again, it doesn't go to the frontal lobe. We basically go into automatic pilot and react in a way that the amygdala is determined that will keep us safe. Perhaps it would be good to give a case example. I had a young lady come into my office some time ago who said, "Dr. Beeman, I've been experiencing anxiety most of my life, but it's getting worse. I get to the point where I'm so afraid I can't get out of the house. When I do get out of the house, I find myself in panicky situations. And frankly, this is interrupting my family, it's interrupting my ability to work, and it's just flat something that I've got to learn how to get rid of. So would you please help me with my panic? I understand I'm going to have anxiety off and on for the rest of my life. I can accept that, but it's the panic that really has me in a quandary. I really do need help with that." So over the course of the next couple of months, I got to know her rather well. And so we worked on some of the triggers that she could identify for her anxiety and for her panic. And she did a really nice job of understanding how to identify them early and to interrupt the anxiety and the panic cycle. But I also learned that when she was about 10 or 11, her family got in a very bad financial situation. So bad that they had to farm out all of her brothers and sisters to other family members. The family basically went homeless. And so she went to live with an aunt and an uncle. And she said things went very well for a little while, but after several months, the uncle would creep down the hallway in the middle of the night to her room and sexually molest her. And this happened repeatedly from about the age of 10 or 11 to about 15 when she finally left the house. And so everything from that significant emotional event, being raped, I would call that a significant emotional event. Everything about that event, the sights, the sounds, the smells, and the texture are burned into her memory. And that, again, is a process that takes place with the help of the hippocampus. So again, we were doing rather well. We had several months under our belt, and she was doing a really nice job of identifying her early warning signs and catching her anxiety before it morphed into panic. Except for this one particular time she came into my office. It must have been right about Christmas, either just before Christmas or right after Christmas, because she came in and said, "I was in the mall and it was very, very crowded, but I enjoy crowds. Crowds are not a trigger for me. I enjoy shopping. I get off on shopping. It's what I do." So the crowds weren't bothering me. And so she went on to explain that she was going from store to store. She was buying things, looking at things, talking with people, and she got to the very last store, and she had an armful of clothes that she had tried on that she wanted to buy. And so she's waiting in line, and finally the line moves and she gets to the counter, and she puts the clothes down on the counter. She gets her purse out, she gets out her debit card, and as she was handing the debit card to the clerk, she said, "I was overcome by a sense of panic. I couldn't breathe, my chest was tight, I was sweating profusely," and she said, without thinking, I dropped my debit card, I left my clothes and my purse and everything on the counter, and I literally ran out of that store, and I ran outside of the mall, hyperventilating. And she said, "Dr. Beeman, for the life of me, outside that store, I couldn't figure out what it was that was triggering that reaction. I thought about everything that I had done that day, and I couldn't come up with anything. I was having fun, I was in my element, but there I was in the midst of a panic attack." So oftentimes with anxiety and panic, you can pinpoint something in the here and now that's getting in the way, something that's triggering, something right now, or something that happened yesterday, or something that we're worried about or upset for tomorrow. But in this case, the young lady said there was nothing like that going on, which led me to believe that there was a subconscious process. So what I did with her is I put her into a very deep, relaxed state. Not hypnosis, but a very deep, relaxed state. And I had her kind of debrief and walk me through what happened when she was at the mall. So she was describing going from store to store, getting into great detail about conversations she was having, things she was trying on, why she would buy this, why she wouldn't buy that. And she got to the part with the last store, and so she's describing she's in line, she's got an armful of clothes, she's telling me about who she's talking to and who she's laughing with, and then she gets to the counter. And she starts to describe the counter situation by putting her clothes down, putting her purse down, getting the debit card out, and then she's talking about the actual movement of the debit card from her hand to the clerk's. And she stops halfway through that movement and says, "Holy crap, I smell it." And I said, "What do you smell?" "I smell the cologne." "What cologne?" "The cologne my uncle used to wear. I can smell it. Somebody in this room has got that cologne on." And she was right. That was the trigger that her amygdala was picking up subconsciously. She wasn't aware of the smell. She was too busy focusing on talking with other people and shopping and getting ready to pay for her purchases. And so the amygdala picked up the smell, automatically registered a threat, and the amygdala thought that the rape situation was about to happen again. You see, the amygdala is not a conscious process. It's just strictly a reactive process. It doesn't care if it overreacts. But it knows that if it doesn't act and if it underreacts, that the person is in jeopardy. So again, its job is to keep this person safe. And so after she learned that this was a trigger for her, she had no idea that was a trigger. She got her boyfriend to stop wearing colognes that reminded her, because that was what was sending her off in panic. And she was constantly on alert for, if I start to feel a little bit anxious, I'm going to sniff the air. And so she'd come back in a couple of weeks later and she said, I was at the grocery store and I started to get anxious, and I thought to myself, all right, now sniff the air and see if there's somebody wearing this cologne. And so she did. And she said, I could smell it. I could smell it. And so what I decided to do was to look around and see if I could figure out who was wearing it. And she said, I could. There was a guy not too far from me, and it was definitely coming from him. And what I did was, and I think this is rather clever of her, and this is really part of the recovery process, she said, what I said to myself was, he's no threat, I could kick his ass. And so she learned how to deal with that. In addition to the cologne, she also figured out that she had an aversion to very rough cloth. You see, her uncle used to wear a shirt called a Pendleton. It's a very rough wool kind of a shirt. So anytime she felt that, she learned that was a trigger as well. Okay. So then we come to a critique of the Diathesis stress model. And the basic question is this: why don't people who experience the same traumatic event, who are exposed to similar emotionally charged triggers, always develop an anxiety panic disorder? And the truth of the matter is that not everybody does that. And maybe an example would be helpful here. I was part of a critical incident stress debriefing team when I was stationed in Europe, in Germany. And so we would respond to natural disasters, to fires, to train wrecks, and this one particular time we responded to an air show disaster at Ramstein Air Base. It seems that the Italian flying team was over the crowd and they crashed into one another, and a giant fireball erupted and fuel spilt down and fire spilt down on the crowd. And so my team and I went from Rhine-Main, where I was stationed, to Ramstein, which is about an hour and a half, 2-hour drive. And when we got there, the air was still full of the smell of jet fuel. There was still the smell of death. There was still burnt parts of aircraft all over the place. And so our job was to debrief the firefighters, the security police, the medics, any of the first responders. And over the course of the next week, we interviewed we conducted about 200 different group sessions. We may have seen maybe 1,000 different individuals throughout the course of our work there. A couple of months later, we went back to the base and started going through the medical records of the people that we interviewed. And we talked with the mental health professionals there at Ramstein, and we determined that there were very few people that actually developed over the course of time a post-traumatic stress disorder, or it had problems with anxiety and panic. Just very few, maybe 5 or 6 out of about 1,000 people that we saw. You see, according to the Diathesis stress model, everyone that was exposed to that event that was later triggered, and believe me, on an airbase there's lots of triggers. For example, jet fuel is in the air all the time. So according to the Diathesis stress model, anyone that was there at the time of the disaster, who later smelt the jet fuel or heard ambulances anywhere on base, would have automatically gone into an anxiety or a panic reaction. But they didn't. And so the question here, basically, in critique of the Diathesis stress model, is why doesn't that happen? The other issue is that a lot of people who have an anxiety or panic disorder wind up taking a substance like Klonopin or Xanax. And medication doesn't do anything about the underlying condition, but an awful lot of folks do wind up as a primary course of treatment, and sometimes as the exclusive course of treatment, they take a central nervous system depressant like a Xanax or a Klonopin. Okay, so your task is to review the biopsychosocial model in the textbook and try to determine why people who experience the same traumatic event and who are exposed to similar emotionally charged triggers don't always develop an anxiety or panic disorder. Read the biopsychosocial model, especially the section that has to do with resilience. I think you'll find your answer there. So in review, we've taken a short look at the physiology of the brain, specifically the limbic system, the thalamus, and the amygdala. We talked a little bit about the physiology of crisis. I provided you a couple of case examples, and we did a short critique of the Diathesis stress model. The next video covers the individual paper on research-based interventions on stress disorders, anxiety disorders, conduct disorders, and ADHD. Thank you.